Hey guys, tonight we're taking a step back in time. Imagine walking into a dark, smoky room filled with laughter, clinking mugs, and the steady hum of voices. The air smells of roasted meat, fresh bread, and the unmistakable scent of alcohol, ale, mead, and wine fill the air. It's a scene pulled from the heart of a medieval tavern, a place where travelers, locals, and adventurers gathered to drink, eat, and exchange tales. As you step over the threshold, the warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth welcomes you, the dim light from candles flickering on wooden tables. People sit in groups, some chatting over their mugs, others lost in their thoughts, looking at the fire or gazing out the small, grimy windows. The tavern is bustling, but there's a sense of familiarity here, too. The same people often fill the same seats, coming back night after night. But it wasn't all warm and cozy. Taverns were places where people came together for a good time, sure, but there were also secrets being whispered in the corners, disputes being settled in hushed tones, and yes, the occasional rowdy fight breaking out after a few too many drinks. Life in medieval taverns was rough, but it was also a crucial part of the social fabric. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The tavern keeper, often the unsung hero of the medieval drinking scene, was the one who held everything together. They were more than just someone behind the bar. They were the social glue of the tavern, balancing the needs of the customers with the realities of keeping the business afloat. Taverns were frequently family-run, with the tavern keeper's spouse and children often working alongside them. But no matter the size of the establishment, the tavern keeper was the one who made sure there was always enough ale on tap and the fire was always burning bright. As you wander through the tavern, your eyes catch the tavern keeper, maybe an older man, his face weathered by years of tending fires and pouring drinks, or a young woman, quick with a joke and even quicker with the tankards. They know the regulars by name, nodding and exchanging a few words with those they see often. But there's a quiet power in their role, too. They are the ones who mediate arguments, make sure things don't get out of hand, and ensure everyone pays their tab at the end of the night. Historians still argue whether tavern keepers were primarily seen as respected members of the community, or whether they were often viewed with suspicion, given the nature of their business. Were they partners in crime or simply neutral facilitators? Either way, taverns couldn't exist without them. Their role was as important as the ale they served. But beyond being the face of the tavern keeper's job was a delicate balancing act. They had to be approachable enough to encourage regulars to keep coming back, yet firm enough to control the more volatile elements of tavern life. Because, let's face it, there was always someone looking to stir things up. The people who filled these taverns were a mix of all walks of life. The regulars came from every corner of society, farmers fresh off the fields, merchants selling their goods, soldiers on leave, and sometimes even nobles looking for a more humble setting than the grandeur of their castles. The tavern was where the boundaries of social rank and wealth began to blur. Here, a lord could sit side by side with a peasant, both indulging in the same drink, both laughing at the same jokes, and sometimes even sharing the same table. You might be seated next to a farmer, his hands rough and worn from working the land, his breath smelling faintly of earth and sweat. Across from him could be a merchant, his finely tailored clothes a sharp contrast to the farmer's tattered tunic. But the merchant, too, comes here for the same simple pleasures, a strong drink, good company, and maybe a bit of gossip. The tavern was a place of community, a sanctuary where people could connect, share stories, and escape their daily grind. For some, the tavern was more than just a stop for a drink. It was a place to network, strike deals, and sometimes engage in a little friendly, or not so friendly, rivalry. Tavern-goers had a tendency to be outspoken, and with a few pints of ale in their bellies, their true feelings often came to the surface. But as lively as the tavern might seem, not everyone came for merriment. The tensions of daily life didn't just disappear once you walked through the door. The tavern could be a place of argument and bitterness, especially when the stress of work, love, or politics reared its head. Even the most jovial of tavern nights could spiral into heated debates or loud brawls, and those weren't always resolved before the sun came up. Historians still debate whether the tavern acted more as a community gathering space or as a kind of refuge from the outside world. Did it serve to reinforce social divisions, or was it a rare space where people of all classes could connect on a human level? What's clear, though, is that the tavern was a hub of social interaction, for better or worse. Medieval taverns were far different from the pubs we know today. In fact, many of the modern features we associate with pubs, like the cozy ambience, the polished bar counter, or the lively, casual nature of the crowd, weren't a part of the medieval tavern experience. These establishments were usually far more utilitarian in nature, often offering little in the way of comfort or privacy. The walls were simple and bare, the floors muddy from the foot traffic, and the seating arrangements, if you could call them that, were often just rough-hewn benches placed haphazardly around the room. Taverns were sometimes quite rudimentary, serving as a gathering place for the local community, but they were also heavily shaped by the needs of travelers. Most taverns doubled as inns, offering shelter to those passing through. You might find yourself sleeping in a cramped, musty room upstairs, with nothing more than a simple cot and a thick blanket to keep you warm. The common room would be alive with the sounds of travelers coming and going, leaving behind stories of far-off places and battles won, while local folk would tell tales of the hardships of the harvest and the latest village gossip. What's interesting, though, is how the concept of the pub didn't truly emerge until the later medieval period. Early taverns were not dedicated solely to drinking, and certainly weren't places to linger over a pint of beer as we do today. These spaces were, at their core, functional. A place to drink if you needed to, but just as often, a place to eat, sleep, and get the news of the day. Historians still debate whether medieval taverns were ever really meant for relaxation. Were they truly a refuge, or just another part of the busy, harsh rhythm of medieval life? Tavern-goers weren't coming for the comfort. They were coming for what it provided: sustenance, shelter, and social connection, however brief or fleeting. Imagine walking into a medieval tavern, your senses immediately greeted by the hearty aromas of freshly baked bread, sizzling meat, and thick stews bubbling away over the fire. Food in medieval taverns wasn't just a side note, it was a central part of the experience. But don't expect anything too refined. The meals were simple, filling, and designed to keep people going through long days of hard work or travel. A common meal might consist of thick, rustic bread, a bowl of pottage, a type of soup or stew, and perhaps a slice of roasted meat if you were lucky. Meat wasn't always available to everyone. Only the wealthier patrons could afford a feast of roasted boar or venison, while the common folk might make do with salted fish or the occasional rabbit. Vegetables, too, were present but often limited in variety, with onions, leeks, and cabbage being the staples of many tavern meals. Yet, for all its simplicity, the food served in medieval taverns had a certain charm. The bread would be crusty on the outside, soft and warm on the inside, perfect for dunking in a bowl of soup or stew. The pottage, though humble, was hearty and filling, often made with whatever was available in the kitchen: root vegetables, grains, and sometimes a bit of meat or fish. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough to sustain the hard-working, often weary, people who made their way to the tavern. Historians still argue about how the quality of food in medieval taverns varied from region to region. Were the meals as simple and sparse as often depicted, or were there exceptions where taverns went the extra mile to provide something special for their guests? Either way, food and drink were always part of the social fabric of the tavern, drawing people in and providing them with both sustenance and a sense of belonging. When you step into a medieval tavern, one of the first things that hits you is the smell of ale. Ale wasn't just a drink, it was the drink of choice for most people in the medieval period, and taverns were the primary place to enjoy it. The drink was often brewed locally and was an essential part of social life. While the quality of the ale varied greatly, depending on the region and the skill of the brewer, it was generally a thick, hearty brew, sometimes more like a soup than the clear beer we know today. Mead, too, was popular in many taverns. This sweet, fermented honey drink could be made stronger or lighter, depending on the local recipe. It was often consumed by those looking for something a bit more special, and it was known to bring a certain warmth to those who drank it. For the wealthier patrons, wine might make an appearance, especially in the southern regions of Europe, where it was more common. Wine, though, was often a rare treat reserved for special occasions, and it wasn't always of the highest quality. But why was ale so important in the medieval tavern? It wasn't just for enjoyment, it was a way of life. Ale was often safer to drink than water, which could be contaminated with disease. The brewing process killed off harmful bacteria, making it a safer alternative. For many, drinking ale was a way to hydrate and nourish themselves, especially after a long day's work. Historians still debate the role of mead in the medieval tavern scene. Was it more of a celebratory drink, or just another option alongside ale and wine? Regardless, alcohol was essential to the tavern's function. Without it, the tavern would have been far less appealing, and its role as a social center would have been far less pronounced. Medieval taverns were never quiet places. As the night progressed, the atmosphere would grow louder, more chaotic, and sometimes downright rowdy. The sound of laughter, shouting, and clinking mugs filled the air, but so did the occasional brawl. It wasn't uncommon for disagreements to erupt after a few too many drinks. A quarrel over a game, a look exchanged in a crowded corner, or even just the frustrations of the day boiling over. These were the sparks that led to the flames of conflict. And these weren't just minor squabbles. Medieval taverns were often the settings for physical fights, fistfights, brawls, and sometimes even full-blown tavern wars. While the tavern keeper tried their best to keep order, things didn't always go according to plan. The combination of alcohol and the pressure of a hard life often made tempers flare. When fists flew, the tavern might descend into chaos, and the fight would spill out into the streets or alleyways. Sometimes, these violent encounters would involve more than just the tavern's regular patrons. Travelers, soldiers, or even local officials could find themselves swept up in the turmoil. But not all of the action was physical. Taverns were also homes to verbal sparring, where insults were hurled, challenges issued, and rivalries deepened. The heat of the moment could turn a friendly gathering into an intense battleground of words, as people argued over politics, religion, or personal grievances. Historians still debate the extent of violence in medieval taverns. Some argue that it was exaggerated by storytellers, while others maintain that brawls were a regular part of tavern life. Either way, there's no denying that a tavern was a place where tensions could boil over, and where you were just as likely to find yourself in a fight as you were to find yourself laughing over a drink. Taverns weren't just places for drinking and fighting. They were also places for entertainment, and not the kind of entertainment we're used to today. Sure, there were games, but these weren't the simple board games or trivia contests you might see in a modern pub. In a medieval tavern, dice, cards, and even gambling were a big part of the fun. Dice games, in particular, were immensely popular. A few throws of the dice could determine a man's fate for the night, whether it meant winning a small fortune or losing a day's wages. The game was simple: roll the dice and hope for the best. However, the stakes could get high, especially when wagers were involved. If you were lucky, you could walk away with a small fortune. If you weren't, well, you might have to settle for a lost night of ale and the bruising shame of defeat. Cards, too, found their place in taverns, though the games were more basic compared to today's card-playing traditions. The focus was more on chance than strategy, and many people came to taverns hoping for a bit of luck to turn the night in their favor. But perhaps the most entertaining aspect of medieval taverns were the performances. Minstrels, poets, and jugglers would often entertain the crowd, providing music, comedy, and the occasional story to lighten the mood. Musicians would play their lutes or flutes, while poets recited tales of heroism, love, and occasionally scandal. These performances brought a festive energy to the tavern and made the evening feel like more than just a place to drink. Historians still argue whether these performances were just a distraction or whether they were deeply tied to medieval social life. Some believe the music and games helped forge social bonds, while others see them as mere distractions from the more serious matters of life. Regardless, entertainment was an integral part of the tavern experience, adding an extra layer of enjoyment and camaraderie to the nights spent there. While the tavern was a place of community and fun, it wasn't without its rules. Despite the free-flowing alcohol and raucous atmosphere, taverns operated under a strict set of laws. These laws were designed to keep order and ensure that the tavern stayed open, as it was a business just like any other. Taverns were subject to local regulations, and tavern keepers were often required to obtain a license to serve alcohol. This license was a prized possession. Without it, the tavern could be shut down. But it wasn't just about the business side of things. Tavern laws also governed the behavior of the patrons. For example, many taverns had a strict, no fighting policy. If a fight broke out, the tavern keeper would often intervene, sometimes with the help of hired muscle, to break up the altercation and restore order. In extreme cases, the brawlers could be fined, kicked out, or even banned from returning. Another rule common in medieval taverns was the ban on excessive drinking. While alcohol was a part of life, tavern keepers had to ensure that their patrons didn't drink themselves into oblivion. They were often expected to watch for signs of drunkenness and cut off customers who had had too much to drink. This wasn't just about protecting the health of the drinkers, it was about keeping the peace. A drunken brawl could quickly escalate into a full-blown riot, and tavern keepers had to avoid that at all costs. But not all tavern laws were so straightforward. Some taverns had additional rules depending on the location. For example, in some regions, it was illegal to sell ale on religious holidays, as the church sought to limit consumption on days of spiritual significance. Tavern keepers who violated such laws could face heavy fines or even imprisonment. Historians still debate the effectiveness of these tavern laws. Were they strictly enforced, or were they more symbolic than anything else? Either way, they were an essential part of the tavern's operation, ensuring that while the fun never stopped, things never got too out of hand. But beneath the lively drinking and gambling, there was always an undercurrent of secrecy within the tavern walls. While the tavern was a place for social interaction and public enjoyment, it was also home to hidden dealings and covert activities that would have shocked the more straightforward patrons. In the back rooms or the darker corners of the tavern, clandestine meetings often took place. Ones that had little to do with ale and far more to do with politics, crime, and illicit trade. In larger towns and cities, taverns were notorious for being the meeting spots for thieves' guilds, mercenaries, and even spies. With the constant influx of travelers, it was the perfect place for people who needed to speak discreetly. Those in the know would often make arrangements in hushed tones, passing coded messages, planning heists, or organizing smuggling operations. A well-established tavern could become a trusted safe house, one where goods, whether stolen or simply untaxed, could be hidden or traded in exchange for a bit of information, a bit of money, or both. For those not involved in these dealings, these secretive activities were invisible, just whispers that floated through the haze of smoke and ale. But the tavern keeper, always the heart of the tavern, was well aware of these hidden transactions. They often walked a fine line, making sure that they didn't get caught up in anything that might jeopardize their business or their safety. If they got involved with the wrong people, their tavern could be raided, their license revoked, or worse. Historians still debate the extent of the tavern's role in secret dealings. Did tavern keepers unknowingly host criminals, or were they complicit in these transactions? Either way, the tavern's role as a place of secrets, as much as it was a place of enjoyment, is undeniable. Even as patrons sang songs and threw dice, others were busy making deals that would shape the future in ways that no one could predict. The relationship between medieval taverns and the church was complicated, to say the least. On one hand, taverns were essential to medieval life, serving as hubs of social interaction, commerce, and even the occasional religious gathering. On the other hand, the church often viewed them with suspicion, seeing them as places of sin, excess, and moral decay. For many clergy, the tavern was the very symbol of vice, with its drinking, gambling, and sometimes questionable behavior. It wasn't uncommon for the church to issue sermons condemning the excesses of tavern life, urging the faithful to avoid them in favor of more virtuous pursuits. This tension was particularly evident during religious festivals or holidays. While taverns remained open, some clergy pushed for limits on alcohol consumption, arguing that it took away from the spiritual focus of the day. In some places, taverns were actually banned from selling alcohol on Sundays or during religious holidays, as the church tried to curb the spread of what it viewed as sinful behavior. Tavern keepers, however, often found ways around such restrictions, either by selling watered-down drinks or finding other legal loopholes to continue their trade. But not all churchmen viewed taverns as purely evil. Some saw them as opportunities for outreach. In certain areas, clergy would visit taverns to preach or to encourage a more pious lifestyle among the patrons. In some cases, tavern keepers themselves were members of the church, and their dual roles as both publicans and parishioners helped to bridge the gap between the sacred and the profane. Tavern sermons, though rare, did occur, and these were often held in the quiet hours when the tavern was less crowded, allowing the words of the clergy to be heard by those who might not otherwise attend regular church services. Historians still argue whether the church's hostility toward taverns was justified or whether it was an overblown moral panic. Did taverns truly present a moral danger, or was this just a case of the church trying to exert control over a popular social institution? Regardless, the dynamic between taverns and the church was one of tension, with both sides vying for the hearts and minds of the people. For travelers, medieval taverns were much more than just places to grab a drink. They were sanctuaries. Whether you were a merchant hauling goods from town to town, a knight returning from battle, or just a weary wanderer, the tavern served as your temporary home. On long journeys, the tavern was the only place that offered warmth, food, drink, and companionship. Tavern keepers were well accustomed to the needs of travelers and often kept extra provisions on hand for those who came through the door. A traveler could expect to be offered a hearty meal, a place by the fire to rest, and perhaps a mug of ale to wash down the dust of the road. And while the conditions in these inns were far from luxurious, they provided the one thing every traveler needed: a place to recharge, if only for a night. It was in the taverns where the stories of travelers came alive. The locals would listen intently as strangers regaled them with tales of distant lands, strange creatures, and the trials of their journeys. Some of these travelers were adventurers in the truest sense of the word, knights, explorers, and mercenaries who had seen battlefields far from home. They would share details of foreign wars, new kings, or perhaps the latest gossip from the royal courts. Others were simple traders, but their stories, often laced with rumors, were no less fascinating. Merchants from the east might share news of goods being shipped from the Orient, while sailors could provide first-hand accounts of the rough seas they'd encountered. Taverns were the lifeblood of these exchanges, a place where news from across the land and beyond could be shared and, just as importantly, heard by those who were most eager for it. Historians still argue whether the tales told in taverns were more than just fabrications. Did travelers exaggerate their adventures, or were these stories often grounded in truth? Regardless of the accuracy, one thing is clear: taverns were essential in spreading news, ideas, and stories across medieval society. Taverns were not just gathering places for the common folk, though. They also played a significant role in the social fabric of medieval storytelling. In these taverns, gossip flowed just as freely as the ale, and rumors spread like wildfire. A well-placed rumor could have an impact on a whole town or even a kingdom, and tavern conversations often carried the seeds for later events. One of the most important elements of medieval tavern life was the exchange of stories. It wasn't just about passing the time, it was about passing on knowledge, myths, and news. It was in these taverns that the legends of knights, battles, and kings were told and retold. Minstrels and poets played a key role, entertaining the crowds with tales of valor and tragedy, songs of love and loss, and the occasional bawdy ballad. These performances brought much-needed distraction and levity, offering a respite from the otherwise harsh realities of life. But it wasn't just the minstrels who were responsible for storytelling in taverns. Every patron who sat at the table brought their own stories. The traveling merchant might regale the room with tales of distant lands, while the farmer might share stories of the harvest or the politics of the local lord. Tavern-goers, after enough drinks, would become storytellers themselves, mixing fact with fiction, spinning yarns of epic proportions. Sometimes, their stories would be half-truths, embroidered with exaggerations, but that's the magic of a tavern. Everything sounds more exciting after a few mugs of ale. Tavern rumors were also the lifeblood of the social dynamics in these spaces. Whether it was word of a local marriage, the latest royal scandal, or gossip about a neighboring village, these rumors were shared with gleeful abandon. Sometimes, these stories even shaped public opinion. If a rumor gained enough traction, it could change the course of a local election, alter the dynamics of a relationship, or even lead to the downfall of a once respected figure. Historians still debate how much of medieval tavern storytelling was rooted in truth and how much was pure invention. Were tavern tales simple distractions? Or did they have real power in shaping medieval society? One thing is for certain: taverns were the centers of storytelling, and without them, much of the news and culture of the time would have spread far more slowly. As the medieval world evolved, so too did the role of taverns. In the earlier centuries, taverns were essential to the survival of communities, offering food, drink, and shelter to travelers. They were integral to the daily rhythms of medieval life, providing a space for exchange, leisure, and sometimes even political maneuvering. But as cities grew and social structures became more complex, the role of the tavern began to shift. By the late medieval period, taverns began to lose some of their original charm. As urbanization spread, so did the rise of more structured and specialized institutions. Inns and lodgings for travelers became more common, as did markets and public houses that offered more refined services. The simple, rustic tavern of the early medieval period gave way to more elaborate establishments that catered to the growing middle class. These newer taverns were often larger, cleaner, and more organized, with menus, house rules, and sometimes even entertainment specific to the tastes of an increasingly sophisticated clientele. However, this shift did not mean the end of taverns. In fact, they evolved into more specialized versions of their former selves. They remained places where people could still gather, drink, and share stories, but now, the focus was often more on leisure and business than on the raw social interactions of old. The introduction of more formal establishments also saw the rise of tavern-based leisure activities, such as drinking games, card playing, and more organized performances, further embedding the tavern in the social life of the town or city. Yet, with this transformation came the decline of the more rough-and-tumble aspects of tavern life. The tavern, which had once been a place of secrecy, illicit dealings, and rough fights, became a more polished and socially acceptable space. The brawls and clandestine deals were replaced by lighter, more socially acceptable entertainments. And yet, in some of the older, quieter taverns, you could still feel the remnants of those raucous times. Historians still argue whether the transformation of the medieval tavern into a more structured establishment was a sign of progress or the loss of something integral to medieval social life. Was it simply the evolution of the times, or did this change strip the tavern of its original spirit, the very essence of what made it a gathering place for all walks of life? Taverns have long left their mark on history, but what legacy did they truly leave behind? The idea of the medieval tavern has evolved, but it continues to live on in the modern concept of the pub, the bar, and the café. While the rough-hewn benches and smoky interiors may be gone, the social function of these establishments has endured. People still gather in pubs and bars to socialize, share stories, and yes, sometimes argue or engage in heated debates over a drink or two. The tavern's role as a social nexus, a place for both the exchange of news and the bonding over shared experiences, has not been forgotten. But the medieval tavern wasn't just about drinking or the tales it spawned, it was about the essence of communal life. It was a place where the threads of society were woven together. The tavern keeper, the regulars, the travelers, the entertainers, and the fleeting visitors all contributed to the dynamic atmosphere that made the tavern such a powerful force in medieval life. And although taverns today might seem like distant relatives to those ancient gathering places, they still serve the same basic function: they bring people together. Whether for a quick drink after work or a lively night out, the essence of the medieval tavern continues to echo through the ages. As the medieval world gave way to the Renaissance and beyond, taverns adapted, shedding much of their rough exterior and expanding into institutions that would eventually become an integral part of modern urban life. Taverns gave birth to the pub culture, which continues to thrive, bringing a sense of warmth, connection, and, at times, a bit of chaos to people's lives. But the legacy of the medieval tavern is also found in the more intimate places, Those neighborhood bars and cafes where friends still gather, strangers still meet, and stories are still shared. Historians might argue whether the tavern's transition was for the better or worse, but it's clear that these spaces played a crucial role in shaping medieval society and have influenced how we still gather today. From the rough, smoke-filled rooms to the modern-day lounges, the spirit of the tavern lives on.